Welcome everyone, it's Chobra, and we are going to start doing weekly recaps for VCT China and VCT Pacific, especially for those of you who are living over in the Western Hemisphere. I thought, obviously, you can't always catch the live matches, although you should probably catch at least one match every week, which is the Nongshim Red Force match, but that'll happen starting this coming weekend because Pacific starts a week later. China started early, just like they did in kickoff, and so we've already had a full week of games with the new patch, mind you, with agents like Waylay, and of course the big changes on Deadlock. So here's a quick breakdown of how each match went through and which players you might want to be looking out for, or maybe even, starting to calm down on the hopium a little bit. So it started on Thursday. China's going to have 2 days of single matches. The very opening match of VCT China Stage 1 in 2025 was XLG versus BLG. So this is going to be the new Ascension team going up against Bilibili Gaming, which at this point, I guess we have to admit they're a pretty, steady team. I'm still in the school of thought that they're not that strong, and I'm not really seeing a reason to be excited for Bilibili anymore. I used to be a big fan of them. But, they're still hanging out in the top 3, top 4 pretty consistently. So they're a good power check team for VCT China. Now, XLG, I was also in the school of thought that they looked pretty decent at kickoff. Like, they looked like they had a good understanding of the fundamentals, and they had a couple of standout moments from the individuals. And I thought over the course of the year, they might be able to make some upsets happen. Maybe top 4 would be ambitious, but still put up a fight for that. It starts out on Pearl, Bilibili's pick. XLG looked okay. They looked kind of like I would expect them to. Meanwhile, BLG actually looked very static. They were playing very spread out defaults, not adapting very well on the defense, things like that. Things I've come to expect from Bilibili Gaming. And XLG takes that win. But then we go to Icebox. XLG pulls out the first ever Waylay in VCT, with Varga playing a solo duelist Waylay on Icebox and Tejo's on both sides. And I will be honest, they had some okay combos with the Tejo and the Gecko to set up for the Waylay, but it is a bit too all in, and that's what a lot of us suspected, is that Waylay kind of has to go all in if she's solo duelist, and so there wasn't enough guaranteed value. Then you go to Fracture, they once again play solo duelist Waylay, and here, Varga looks really uncomfortable on the Waylay. Like, he's playing very scared, using that Refract to TP back immediately the moment he sees somebody, things like that. So just not able to really get much value unless he's getting the kills with dry peaks and things like that. And so at the end of the day, it's a big question mark of whether it's the solo duelist Waylay that was holding them back, or if the team's also just kind of struggling with making sure they're all on the same page, the same pace, to have that confidence to put up the fights against their opponents. Because quite frankly, if they looked a bit more comfortable, this might have even been a 2-0 for XLG. And I would say that that spells a little bit of worry for Bilibili Gaming as well, because on paper, they should have won this pretty handily. I just want to point out, Coconut also had a pretty rough game for XLG, and then Happyway is another one of those players that a lot of people were kind of looking after or looking into after kickoff, saying, okay, this might be one of the standout players, but he had some decent kills, but the impact wasn't quite there, especially in the most important rounds or clutch moments, things like that. So all in all, I mean, I'm going to say it just like it is. Not very exciting to look into in terms of the results here. Bilibili, still just Bilibili, kind of a good power check team for top 4. XLG, I'm curious if they change their comps. Moving on to day 2, it's Trace Esports versus All Gamers. All Gamers with 11 players on their roster, and Trace Esports with a very disappointing run at Masters Bangkok. And I think that's important to point out, because this was supposed to be the year that a lot of people were going to start paying attention to China, with EDG winning last year at Champions. And then we were all pretty excited. Trace Esports looked really solid at kickoff regionally, and then they go to Masters Bangkok, and we can't find a single trace of the Trace Esports that played in kickoff. They just bomb out of the tournament. They really didn't leave any impact at all at Bangkok out of the 8 teams. And so, there's now 2 sides to the coin. One side was Trace fans who are like, no, it's okay. They messed up. They'll regroup. It's going to be all right. And then the other school of thought was, okay, they've shown themselves, right? And they looked a little bit closer to the latter. Trace Esports ends up looking very messy, and I wonder if it has to do with them trying to streamline their roles a bit more, where they used to trade off with Feng Feng and Kai on the main duelist between like the Jets and the Razes, and it looks like they're trying to lean more into Feng Feng being a bit of a flex on the other side, and Kai just being the sole primary duelist. But Feng Feng looked a little bit lost at times playing that Tejo, right? Sometimes he was looking a little bit off in the timings or just a little bit too aggressive without having the same escapes that he used to. Granted, he was always a bit of a high risk, high reward player. Now, Luo King and Kai continued to frag out for Trace Esports, and even Hebei was fragging a decent amount in this match. But on the flip side, Bianca, the IGL, was definitely struggling in a couple of these duels. But when it comes to those frags, if you look at the way Kai was playing, especially on that Neon, like he was just going in there and fighting. It almost looked at times that he was just playing solo queue and just carrying the game or trying to carry the game, where I'm not necessarily impressed by the team working around his frags. It's just that, okay, like Kai's pretty good. Like he's getting kills, he's getting multi-kills and things like that. But I'm not really seeing anything where I can feel that I can trust this team to bring home the win. I guess thankfully for Trace Esports, their opponents was all gamers with 11 players, and we still don't know if the 5 that played that day are going to be the starting 5 for the rest of the year. And all gamers, I mean, they just couldn't warm up in the first half of Pearl. They actually go for a great fake comeback in the later half with Kira and Delby warming up. But there was a clear firepower difference. And that's really what barely got Trace Esports over the edge, I would argue. Now, the primary duelist for all gamers, Hanche, looked rough on the Neon. Actually got more kills on the Neon, but I want to say, especially in comparison to Kai, just going in full confidence, Hanche looked a little bit shaky on the Neon, whereas they also played Waylay on the second and third map. Hanche was looking like he was getting a lot more value with the Waylay, even if he wasn't getting kills. Like he was going in to create the space. He was working off of the combo utils that was coming out from his team. Now, they were once again playing solo duelist as well, which I think is still questionable when it comes to that agent. But I just want to give that little pointer for Hanche. We'll see if maybe, he finds his own groove with something like the Waylay. Now, there was a world where this could have been a 2-0 once again, right? So this is another game where I think in some crazy world, all gamers could have actually made the upset happen and Trace Esports would have been absolutely down in the dumps. But it goes to split on map 3 and it's straight up skill difference. Trace Esports crushes them 13-1. And so, yeah, they redeemed themselves a little bit, but it's more like they got out of danger rather than, oh, hey, like Trace is looking good. It was just that one map. I would say Trace is still on a little bit of alert in terms of concern. And for all gamers, I'm not even trying to meme here, but the biggest question is what is their roster going to look like down the road? Day 3 starts of the double whammies, right? The double matches. The first one of day 3 on Saturday was DRG, Dragon Ranger Gaming versus Nova Esports. Now, especially the way Trace Esports looked and a little bit of Billy Gaming, I was looking at this and I thought, in my opinion, this was going to be the match that told us what the third best team might become. What the third best team to go to Masters Toronto might be, because DRG has always had the firepower to kind of hang out, right? Even going to an international last year. And then Nova Esports was on the up and up. And then they made that big change in between kickoff and now for stage 1, where they said, okay, we're going to go back to an all Chinese roster. We're putting Swirl on the bench because we want to focus on the language and the comms. And obviously, it was very successful at the Evolution series for Nova, going with a lot of sweeps in those matches. And CB even did an interview where, he talks about, hey, this was really important for us because we needed to prove that the all-Chinese roster works, right? That there was a language barrier and that we had to feel comfortable with this change. Well, what they forgot was that there's a man named Vukashu on the other end at DRG, and he shows up first map of stage 1, drops a 390 ACS, a 2.3 KD, no assists as the Cypher, starting with attack on Fracture. So that about tells the whole story. I mean, they ran into Vukashu and they were dead. And to the point where they started to just play scared anytime they noticed that Vukashu was on the site or going, in front of them wherever they might be. Vukashu just frags out. Like, he just frags out this entire game. And so there wasn't much more to look into it. But DRG also had their own roster change where Luke was transferred over to TEC, their old primary duelist. So now Spirit Z1. Spirit's coming in as the new duelist. And I have to give him props. I think he looked actually really reliable as a good space creator and an entry. He didn't have the flashiest kills, but he was still getting the frags he needed to. And he was doing the job of opening up the sites. And I think that's okay because in terms of just sweeping all the frags together and pulling rounds out of your butt, they've already got Vukashu to do that for them. So Spirits doesn't need to do that. Obviously, if he can, sometimes it's great, but that's not all on him as a duelist. So I think, he looked very good, filling in this role as a primary duelist. And still holding his own on a couple of these, duels as well, and the first frags and things like that. Flip side, Nova, was it the Vukashu effect? Was it something else? We're not sure, but they looked pretty rough, right? This whole promise of it's going to be a lot more fluid, we're all on the same page because we're all just calming simply in Chinese. It wasn't there. It wasn't there in the beginning of that match. And especially Guang, one of the star players on this roster, started on, the Sentinel role or started on the duelist role there, was looking a little bit rough. So I think you have to consider, do we put Guang, onto just pure duelists now? Is that a comfort thing? Where do we go from here? Meanwhile, Obi-Wan is the player that actually got brought back into the starting roster to fill in that slot, right? The 5th slot. And Obi-Wan was fine. But also, again, mostly everyone had negative KDs here for Nova Esports. So it's hard to tell if it was a good game or not for Obi-Wan. If you want to pick out a bright spot for Nova Esports, it would be that despite all of this, Azir was the only one who went positive in the match. So still able to hold his own in the duels that he was taking. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if fans already are calling for Swirl to return to the starting roster. And I think Nova Esports is going to have to do a lot more to prove that that's not what they needed, because this match against DRG, it was not building any confidence in that change. The second match of day 3 was Tyloo versus EDG. Now, EDG did make playoffs at Masters Bangkok. However, they also said in several of their interviews and press conferences that, they maybe felt the pressure a little bit. Some of the players felt more pressure than they thought they would. They felt that they were a little bit behind on the meta. They looked a little bit disappointed in their result. And I would say that they definitely ran out of steam compared to how they usually do, where they actually ramp up towards the end of a tournament. So maybe not the result that you were wanting from the reigning champions of Champions 2024. Obviously still an okay result. But that's not what they're going to want, and that's not what the Chinese fans in the region is going to want either, because EDG, of course, is supposed to be that team that continues to shine for VCT China. Well, they're back in China, and they do exactly that. Kong is still him, and EDG's back to experimenting. They bring out the Waylay themselves over on Fracture. It turns into a mirror matchup, and Kong is just putting out an absolute frag diff against the enemies. Now, against Ninebody, it wasn't a Waylay diff. It was really just a Kong diff. It was an aim diff for the most part. EDG did have some good combos where Kong was immediately following up on util to fill that space, but it also wasn't like the craziest thing or things that really would have changed the round if an opponent was there. It was mostly just, okay, you've got your timings down and you understand the core concept of how you would want to play a solo duelist Waylay. Both teams did play that solo duelist again as well, which personally I'm still a little hesitant on. But overall in the whole match, Kong puts a plus 25 kill diff across 2 maps, only 39 rounds. So less than 40 rounds played across 2 maps, and he's putting up plus 25. It's a crazy stat. And then Simon also putting up 30 assists across the 2 maps, and even picking up, some good kill secures for himself as well. So everyone was performing as they want to be on EDG. I will say, especially on Fracture with the Waylay, Kong was showing some moments where he was playing good bait for his teammates, right? Where he's going in, drawing that crosshair, refracting back out. Someone peeks out to trade for him, or someone's already ready over at a long crossfire. They've got their crosshairs trained. They pick off the kill, things like that. So it shows that the comms are good there. The understanding of the agent is coming along quite well for EDG. And I think EDG is going to be just fine in stage 1. On the flip side for Tyloo, they picked into Fracture, and EDG looked pretty good on Fracture at Masters Bangkok. So I have to imagine that they picked it because they thought their Waylay pick could kind of throw off EDG, that maybe they've been cooking a bit more and they could jump right into adjusting for Waylay once the agent was released and whatever else it might be. But maybe they got caught off guard by Kong picking Waylay himself. And especially, again, typical scenario, just like we saw, against DRG with Vukashu, but Ninebody starts to play really scared. He's playing that Waylay, and he just doesn't want to dive in because he's not winning any of these opening duels against Chichu or Kong on the other side. And that's very, very unfortunate. Also, our favorite Alphabet Man, HFMI, very rough game. And so this is where I started to look at it. there was a lot of Taeho play, and we should remember that China didn't actually start with Taeho at kickoff, which resulted in them mostly just not picking it for the rest of the tournament because they didn't want to shift their meta mid-tournament. A lot of the Taehos here in the first week of stage 1 in China were near the bottom. Now, sometimes it's just because, you're doing zone clear, you're not getting assists because you're not damaging anybody, whatever else it might be. But generally, they didn't have the best scores. And I wonder, even though they had time to practice, if it's also a matter of, the Taeho pacing or the player themselves who's playing the Taeho, they're trying to adjust to the timing and the positioning and whatever else it might take to play a good Taeho who can not only provide zoning, but also the fragging power and the firepower they themselves need. But that could just be a coincidental thing. I wouldn't read into it too much, but that is a pattern that we saw over the course of the first week. And this could also be a result of maybe, your entry players weren't really getting the opening frags that you needed, and then you were already in a bad position. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. I don't think it has anything to do with the Taeho nerf, because I don't think that's really going to result in changing the actual stat line. Going on to the last day of the week on Sunday, JDG versus Wolves. And TMV is going to be happy about this one because while it got dicey a little bit here and there, Wolves eventually pull out the win. I am going to go ahead and say I don't think it still deserves the hype that TMV is trying to build up for this team. I know he's got his loyalties that he has to serve, but the fact that it got this close, I think, especially with some of the performances they had individually, is still a bit concerning in terms of, Wolves is probably going to be a fine mid-range team, but are they ready to break into an international? Questionable so far. But, so in the 2 maps that they've shown, Juicy's back on primary duelist playing that Yoru, and I think that's something to keep your eye on because, of course, that was his original role way back when he was, building up his career with Bleed Esports in Challengers. So playing that Yoru, Juicy was fragging out, and they actually brought out an interesting Yoru Chamber Deadlock composition on Pearl, and I don't think it was very convincing on the attacking side. However, on the defensive side, they really took advantage of the double TP, allowing them to take very aggressive angles. And so the Chamber and the Yoru just going out there, taking the first fights, pushing people back, and then TPing away and going for rotates. And then I would also say Lysor deserves some credit for the deadlock because the way he was using those sonic sensors, he would oftentimes use kind of spread out sonic sensors for info on the default. And then after a certain time or after they got initial contact, immediately switch that up as a defensive way to stop the opponents from diving in because the opponents were also playing Yoru. So he was always getting prepared for the Yoru TPs where it normally goes on site. So you can really delay both the second line of attack, but also the Yoru. So Stu's not just running amok on the site. So a little bit of, I think, targeted good counter against a team who has a star duelist. Speaking of Stu, I don't know if solo Yoru is what you want to play when a big part of your win condition for JDG is Stu go kill. And we don't mean this in a negative way. It's just that Stu is a standout player, right? Win or lose, he's always been a very standout player within VCT China. But if you play solo duelist Yoru, you have to go in and get frags. You have to have perfect timing. You also have to provide good support with the flashes. Sometimes you have to go for the lurks. You have to go for the rotations. You have to throw the fakes. There's a lot residing on you. And the reason Yoru is getting picked a lot is because that agent can do it on their own, but I think it's a lot of pressure as well for that one person to have to cover a lot of bases, especially if you also can't feel comfortable just sometimes being that sacrificial lamb. So I do want to question perhaps that compositional choice coming out for JDG. Now, they didn't play that over on Haven. They actually played the Yoru ISO comp, but Stu playing ISO, and that was somewhat of a uncharacteristic game where he just wasn't really putting up the same performances that we normally expect from him. And I wonder if it's because he's not able to just go in and create the timing and space that he wants, right, as that ISO. We also didn't see many moments where we saw the impact of the change to ISO. And maybe, in fact, we maybe saw the negative impact of not being able to just immediately send out the undercuts to get map space early on. But a bit of a rough showing. Now, another fake comeback coming in from JDG, so it was definitely doable, but I do think JDG maybe has to reconsider their compositions a little bit, but in the end of the day, Wolves, they also just welcome some of these crazy fights, right? If it just gets into an absolute, mud fight, they welcome it, they shine in those situations, and I think teams who really shine in those skirmishes are going to be good to be kind of that gatekeeping team in the mid-range. So Wolves probably okay in the mid-range. We'll see if they actually grow over the course of Stage 1 to try to eventually break into either Masters Toronto or Champions in Paris down the line. Last but not least, and this was my favorite match of the first week for VCT China, it's FPX versus Titan Esports Club. So Fun Plus Phoenix versus Titan Esports. And there were some good stories coming into this one, right? TEC, they've slowly been collecting kind of these old dogs within VCT China that have the veterancy. You've got RB coming over from Korea. Hao Dong joins after, his tenure on EDG, both as a player and as a playing coach. Same with After coming in as the coach as well. And then they just had Luke transfer over from DRG as well. So there were some maybe some excitement for TEC fans of like, okay, are they finally going to come along and at least become a reliable mid-range team? Whereas FPX, actually, they lost their IGL in Berlin, who has now retired for health and personal reasons. And they also had a coach change as well. So Nathan D was out and York coming in. So FPX... the question was Autumn supposed to be IGLing as the Australian on this team? And then we were told that Yosemite was going to do the side calling in Chinese, but the question was how much of it is translated? How much of it is done in English? What does that even look like? Personally, I didn't have too big of a hope just because I didn't want to be disappointed. Maybe they have to shake things out in a live setting and that's okay. But pleasantly surprised. I mean, FPX were putting up some plays very reminiscent of 2024 Gen G, where they had a solid understanding of how to play rotations, timings, and number advantages, right? So constantly poking in for info. Based on the info you get, you make sure you rotate so you have the number advantage, and then you still leave an option to rotate back on a lurk. And this was just, it was almost as if it was just calculated just by the T, where it was very fluid. There was no hesitation, and we saw one of the replays where when Autumn's calling and asking for info, it's all done in English, but if he goes down or if he's not part of the core that needs to get that information, they're calling in Chinese, and I assume Autumn can pick up on most of it now with his time over in China. But with all of that said, I mean, they looked smooth. That doesn't mean they looked perfect. They didn't bring out anything groundbreakingly new, but they looked clean in their calls, both the round-to-round reads, but also the mid-rounding. And if we're to believe that Yosemite was a big part of that mid-rounding, he was also putting up top frags for his team across both maps. So really impressive showing from both Autumn and Yosemite leading that team. Life, as a duelist, a little bit whiffy at times, but he always has been, right? He still shows up in the big moments when he needs to. But it was to the point because they played number advantages, no longer did they have to worry about life whiffing and creating a hole and a gap in their game plan because someone was always there to trade. And I think that's a huge evolution for a team that was kind of known as the mad scientists of VCT China. And so I'm curious to see if they can keep this up because obviously TEC on the other side wasn't playing very consistently. Luke, also a bit of an inconsistent player. So they really just had a bunch of inconsistencies across the board individually. And while that also means they had some good moments with, like eco rounds and sheriffs and one taps and whatnot, we didn't really see a lot of convincing play coming out from them. I do want to give credit to TC for bringing out the first double duelist with Waylay, using the Waylay with the Neon on Haven. And I do think Neon's one of the duelists you can use Waylay with to create some good combos. However, on paper, that's also a very one-dimensional composition, right? You have to commit to take space. You kind of know after a couple of times what that's going to look like. You're relying on the speed and those agents kind of baiting for each other with their movement to be able to get those trades and the kills. And eventually FPX just read right through it. They said, okay, they're going to have to push out here. They're going to have to attack here. And once we catch one of those agents, we know that it's coming to the site, or we know they're defending outside of here. So either we wait or we poke somewhere else and rotate back, and FPX had really good responses, really good protocol against that. So I will give, credit to TEC. They tried the solo duelist Waylay as well on Icebox. And just across this first week, the Waylay on Icebox, I'm not convinced, but the Tejo's on Icebox, very convinced, very strong, very annoying both on the attack and defense. So we got a good look at that. But outside of that, the Neon Waylay, I can see some teams still doing something like that, even on Haven. But obviously, you're sacrificing depth in terms of strategy into we just have advantages in these skirmishes because we can have really good trades and baits and whatever else and good util. So curious to see if other teams lean into that. But All things said, I think FPX is back in the running to be a clear top 2 team in VCT China. If they can keep this up going into week 2, regardless of opponent, like if it's pretty consistent, I mean, that type of consistency, right? The Gen G style of play from 2024, it gives you a guaranteed result. You're playing a numbers game, and I think that will be huge for not just FPX, but for VCT China overall. That's going to be it for week 1 of VCT China. Again, this was on the new patch, and we got some good looks at some of it. You know, the deadlock play a little bit here and there. I think we saw some good changes from that. The Waylay, of course, showed up a lot. I actually think that might kind of get bumped down after some of the, or most of the disappointing results. But for now, it is looking like it's still going to be EDG's playground. And so hopefully for VCT China and the fans that are looking forward to that region growing, we see teams continue to iterate week to week to see who can continue to challenge into that top 3, top 4 slot. That's going to be it for this one. We'll be back next week with VCT China and, of course, a separate video for VCT Pacific start. But if you liked this content, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment down below as well in which team you're looking forward to the most in VCT China. And I'll be back next week with week 2's matches. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.